The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket Alex Vance hadn't realized he'd been missing until now. After 3 tours, the cacophony of war had become his default soundtrack, the distant thud of artillery, the urgent crackle of radio static, the ever-present hum of fear. Stepping onto the porch of his childhood home, the quiet was almost deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. A decorated Sergeant Alex had faced down far worse than an empty house, yet a peculiar, almost imperceptible chill snaked its way down his spine. He instantly dismissed it as the lingering ghost of adrenaline finally dissipating. This was home. This was peace. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, reconnecting with old routines, and the awkward quiet of adjusting to civilian life. He meticulously arranged his uniform in the closet, the metals glinting under the dim light, a stark contrast to the casual wear he now donned. He cooked simple meals, walked the dog, and tried to fall back into the rhythm of a world that felt both familiar and strangely alien. It was during these mundane moments that the first anomalies began to surface, tiny ripples in the calm surface of his homecoming. A book he swore he'd left on the nightstand now rested on the coffee table, a cupboard door definitely closed, found ajar. He chalked it up to memory lapses, the lingering effects of jet lag, or perhaps just the sheer disorganization of a house left dormant for too long. But then came the fleeting glimpses, the sensations that defied easy explanation, shadow too quick to be real, darting across the hallway when he was alone. A flicker in his peripheral vision like someone had just stepped out of sight, only for him to turn and find nothing but empty space. His combat training screamed threat assessment, yet there was no enemy, no discernible source. He'd pause, heart rate quickening, scanning the room with the practiced intensity of a soldier, only to find the silence unbroken, the air still. He told himself it was his mind playing tricks. The hypervigilance of a veteran struggling to decompress, projecting threats where none existed. The unease, though subtle, began to gnaw at him. He was a man of logic, of tangible threats and measurable risks. This amorphous sense of otherness in his own home was frustrating. An enemy he couldn't pinpoint, couldn't engage. He found himself checking locks more often, casting quick glances over his shoulder. A habit he thought he'd left on the battlefield. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt observed, not hostile, not overtly menacing, but with an unsettling presence, a feeling of being a guest in his own domain, as if someone else had been living there, waiting for his return. One evening, after meticulously ensuring all windows were latched and doors secured, Alex settled into his armchair, determined to shake off the irrational feeling. He closed his eyes, seeking the elusive peace. A faint, almost imperceptible creak echoed from the upstairs landing. His eyes snapped open. He held his breath, listening. Nothing. Just the house settling. Yet a cold certainty settled in his gut. That wasn't the house settling. It was the sound of a floorboard groaning under weight, a soft, deliberate step. He was alone, or at least he was supposed to be. The homecoming he'd dreamed of was rapidly becoming a waking nightmare. Alex tried to bury the war under layers of routine. Mornings at the local diner, long runs through familiar parks, evenings spent attempting to reconnect with old friends. But the world felt off, like a television tuned to a slightly wrong frequency, just enough static to be noticeable. He dismissed the fleeting glimpses, the peripheral blurs, as residual stress, the aftershocks of adrenaline. The quiet hum of his empty house, once a comfort, now felt heavy, pregnant with an unspoken presence. He told himself it was just the silence, a stark contrast to the constant battlefield cacophony. Then the incidents began to sharpen. A coffee mug left on the counter would be found inexplicably moved to the sink. Keys, placed meticulously by the door, would reappear on his bedside table. Small, insignificant shifts he initially attributed to his own absent-mindedness, a side effect of a mind still processing trauma. He'd laugh it off, muttering about combat brain, but a cold knot of unease began to tighten. The rational explanations, once so readily available, started to feel thin, stretched taut over an increasingly perplexing reality. The whispers started subtly too, faint, almost inaudible murmurs at the edge of his hearing, like conversations from another room just out of reach. He'd turn, convinced someone was calling his name, only to find himself alone. PTSD, he concluded. Auditory hallucinations were a known symptom. His therapist had warned him about the mind playing tricks, conjuring ghosts from the past. He clung to this diagnosis, a lifeline in a sea of escalating strangeness. It was easier to believe his mind was fracturing than to confront the unsettling possibility of something else. But the incidents grew more specific, more targeted. A framed photograph of his squad taken before their final deployment would be found face down. His military dog tags, usually stored in a locked box, once appeared on his pillow. These weren't random occurrences. They felt deliberate, almost pointed. The whispers shifted too, no longer just indistinct murmurs, but fragmented words. Half-formed sentences that seemed to speak directly to his deepest fears, echoing phrases from mission briefings. He started to doubt his own sanity, the lines between reality and delusion blurring. And then the flashbacks began to claw their way back, not as the usual nightmares, but as vivid waking fragments. A blinding flash, the acrid smell of burning metal, the choked cry of a fallen comrade. He'd be standing in his kitchen, suddenly transported back to dust-choked alleyways. His rifle heavy, the air thick with tension. These weren't just memories. They were intrusions, violent breaches in his present. The strange occurrences, the unsettling whispers, the specific movements, they all seemed to coalesce around these emerging fragments, as if a suppressed truth was desperately trying to break through. His fractured mind, once attributed to PTSD, was now showing signs of something far more sinister, something that defied simple psychological explanation. The fleeting glimpse was no longer fleeting. It was a smudge, a distortion in the air, a deeper shade of night clinging to the periphery of his vision. Alex would spin, heart hammering, only to find the space empty. But the feeling lingered, a cold dread deep in his bones, no longer just battle fatigue, but something far more insidious. It was a presence undeniably real, yet frustratingly intangible, a phantom limb of fear that now throbbed with a persistent ache. The whispers, too, had grown bolder, intertwining with echoes of that fateful ambush, making it impossible to discern memory from malevolence. He found himself scanning empty rooms, a primal instinct screaming at him to flee from something he couldn't even name. His first logical step, he reasoned, was to confide in someone. His therapist, Dr. Albright, a kind clinical woman, had guided him through initial PTSD recovery. Alex began tentatively, describing the moving objects, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. He watched her face, hoping for understanding. Instead, he saw a familiar professional nod, a slight furrow of the brow. She listened patiently, scribbled notes, then gently steered the conversation back to triggers, coping mechanisms, to the well-documented psychological effects of severe trauma. Her words were a rational balm, reassuring, but felt like a dismissal, delicate sidestepping of the very real terror he experienced. He tried again, with a former squad mate. But recounting a self-rocking chair and a distinct chill was met with uncomfortable silence, followed by a suggestion to get some sleep. Man, now you're probably just strung out. Even his sister, usually his staunchest ally, urged him to double down on therapy, expressing concern about his isolation and the vividness of his nightmares, each well-meaning but unhelpful. Response chipped away at his resolve, reinforcing the idea that he was, indeed, losing his grip. The world outside his apartment now felt like a vast, uncaring void, leaving him utterly alone with his burgeoning madness. It's important to remember that if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, especially after traumatic experiences, help is available. Reaching out to a mental health professional, a support group, or a crisis hotline can make a significant difference. You are not alone, and there are people who want to help you through it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. With every dismissal, with every rational explanation he could muster for the inexplicable, the shadow only seemed to deepen. It no longer just flickered at the edge of his vision. It lingered, a subtle darkening in the corner of a room, a momentary blur behind his reflection in a mirror. It was always just out of reach, retreating the instant he turned, but its presence was becoming undeniable, more substantial, more hungry. It fed on his doubt, on his despair, on the crushing weight of his isolation. He could almost feel its malevolent satisfaction, a cold tendril of triumph that snaked around his heart, tightening its grip with each passing day. The entity thrived on his helplessness, growing stronger as he questioned his own sanity. Alex began to retreat further into himself. His apartment became both his refuge and his prison. The fear of being judged, of being labeled irrevocably broken by the outside world, outweighed his desperate need for understanding. He stopped calling his friends, canceled his therapy appointments. He chose the predictable terror of his home over the bewildered pity of outsiders. The shadow, now an almost constant companion in his peripheral vision, seemed to mock his every attempt at normalcy. It was no longer just a symptom of his trauma. It was a predator, patiently stalking its prey, confident in its growing power. It was trapped, caught between a world that refused to believe him and an unseen horror that was slowly, methodically consuming his very being. The stain on his solitude was growing, spreading, threatening to engulf him entirely. The quiet hum of his apartment, once a sanctuary, now echoed with a constant, impending dread. Alex found himself caught in a waking nightmare, the line between reality and hallucination blurring with terrifying speed. The shadow, no longer fleeting, had solidified at the edges of his vision, a silent, ravenous observer. Its presence was a suffocating weight, pressing down on his fragile psyche, amplifying every doubt and every fear. He'd tried to fight it, to rationalize it away, but the phenomenon's persistence, combined with his own unraveling mental state, left him terrifyingly vulnerable. Fragmented combat flashbacks, once sporadic, now crashed over him in relentless waves, each one more potent and disorienting than the last. One harsh afternoon, as rain lashed against his window, a new visceral flashback seized him. The sterile air of his living room vanished, replaced by the acrid stench of cordite and damp earth. The sound of the rain against the glass became the rhythmic thud of helicopter rotor blades, growing louder and louder. His hands gripping the arms of his chair suddenly felt the rough, cold metal of a rifle. He was no longer home. He was back in a desolate, war-torn village under a smoke-choked sky. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating silence broken only by the crackle of a faulty radio and his squattie's ragged breaths. The vividness of it was absolute, terrifyingly real, pulling him under. And then the horror unfolded. A deafening explosion ripped through the air, followed by the screams of soldiers and the piercing cries of children. Dust and debris rained down. Faces etched with fear, both military and civilian, appeared through the haze. A young boy, clutching a tattered teddy bear, stumbled directly into his line of sight. The world had dismissed Alex. He was just another casualty of war whose mind had fractured under the strain. His pleas for help were met with skepticism, clinical diagnoses, and useless advice. But as the shadow solidified, its presence a chilling, undeniable weight in the room, Alex knew this was no figment of his imagination. This was real. This was persistent. And it was terrifying. Alone, he came to a stark realization. If he wanted answers, if he wanted to reclaim his sanity, he would have to find them himself. The official channels had failed him. He would have to delve into the darkness on his own terms, driven by a primal need for the truth, no matter how horrifying it turned out to be. His first recourse was the military archives. Dusty boxes, microfilmed reports, encrypted files, Alex plunged headfirst into a past he had desperately tried to bury. He was looking for any anomaly, any forgotten detail connected to the incident that haunted his waking moments and his nightmares. He cross-referenced after-action reports with intelligence briefings, scrutinizing casualty lists and mission debriefs. Hours blurred into days, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate flickering hope. He sifted through fragmented truths, convinced that the key to his haunting lay hidden somewhere within the sterile, lifeless military documentation, a silent scream buried beneath pages of redacted text. The next step was more painful. He had to reach out to the ghosts of his past, the men he served with, his brothers in arms, who had shared those unimaginable horrors. Years of silence had built walls between them, and the thought of breaking that silence to discuss a haunting filled him with dread. But desperation outweighed his pride. He dialed phone numbers that hadn't been touched in a decade. He sent hesitant, carefully worded emails. Each one was a gamble, risking ridicule or outright dismissal. Some didn't answer. Others offered polite but firm deflections. But a few listened. Their voices were tinged with their own unspoken burdens, and they offered him glimmers of shared memory, fragments of a truth that they, too, had tried to forget. Throughout this arduous, self-imposed investigation, the shadow remained Alex's constant, silent companion. It lurked in the periphery of his vision as he scrolled through endless files, a dark smudge against the computer screen. It coiled in the corners of his room, its presence a cold draft on his skin. It was a silent observer, guarding the very secrets he sought. Its intensity seemed to ebb and flow with his progress, increasing its oppressive weight whenever he got close to a breakthrough, then receding when he hit a dead end. It was almost as if it was manipulating his search, pushing him towards an inevitable, terrifying revelation. The line between sanity and obsession blurred into non-existence. Alex was unraveling, his mind a frayed tapestry of theories, fears, and fragmented memories. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford, haunted by the incident and the ever-present shadow. Yet amidst the chaos, a pattern began to emerge. A horrifying mosaic started to form from forgotten details and hushed, half-remembered conversations. The truth, or at least a glimpse of it, was far more insidious than he could have ever imagined. It hinted at a cover-up, a deliberate erasure of something sinister. And as he edged closer to it, the shadow's watch intensified, its silent gaze promising not just revelation but a reckoning. Alex's relentless pursuit led him down countless dead ends, each one a fresh layer of dust on an already obscure past. He'd spent weeks poring over declassified reports, his eyes blurring from the endless rows of redacted text. His calls to former squad mates were met with either silence or vague, uncomfortable pleasantries. The shadow, meanwhile, seemed to grow bolder, its presence a constant, chilling hum beneath his skin, a silent judgment on his fruitless efforts. Just as despair threatened to consume him entirely, a forgotten box in the attic labeled simply Deployment Bravo Co. caught his attention. Inside, among faded photos and forgotten trinkets, was a tattered, unofficial logbook. It wasn't a smoking gun, not a confession etched in blood, but it contained a series of cryptic entries, scribbled in a hand Alex faintly recognized. The dates didn't align with the official reports. Names were crossed out, then reinserted with question marks beside them. But one particular entry, dated just days before their squad's final, catastrophic mission, made his blood run cold. It mentioned the exchange and a necessary silence. It spoke of a decision made under duress, a compromise that felt less like a strategy and more like a desperate moral surrender. A chill that had nothing to do with the attic's damp air ran down Alex's spine. What had they traded? What silence was so necessary, so utterly damning? The implications were horrifying. This wasn't a random act of war. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a calculated decision, a dark pact forged in the crucible of battle, designed to protect something or someone at a terrible cost. The missing pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening thud. The shadow, which had been a distant observer until now, pulsed with an almost tangible rage. A low thrum vibrated through the floorboards, as if his very thoughts were a threat to its existence. If you're finding this story as gripping as Alex is finding these revelations, please hit that like button and share your theories in the comments below. What do you think was exchanged? The shadow wasn't just an echo of his trauma. It was the embodiment of that unspoken bargain, a spectral guardian of the truth they had buried. The logbook hinted at a desperate choice made to save a few by sacrificing others, perhaps even innocent lives, all under the guise of military necessity. A local informant? A civilian family? Maybe even a rival faction's secret cache? The details were still hazy, but the moral stain was clear and indelible. This wasn't just about a fallen comrade. It was about a betrayal, promise broken to the dead, or perhaps to the living who were left behind to bear the crushing weight of their silence. As Alex connected the dots, a chilling realization dawned on him. The shadow wasn't just showing him the truth. It was protecting it. The moment he grasped the core of the unspoken bargain, the air in the attic grew frigid. The dim light flickered violently, and a guttural, non-human shriek tore through the silence. Objects rattled, then flew from shelves, propelled by an unseen force. The shadow, now a swirling vortex of pure malevolence, surged forward. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was a physical barrier, a terrifying manifestation determined to silence him. To bury the truth once more and to ensure that the bargain of the battlefield remained forever forgotten. The violent surge that ripped through Alex's consciousness wasn't just a psychological break. It was a physical manifestation of the Shadow's raw, untamed power. The entity, now revealed as more than a mere specter of guilt, reacted with primal ferocity, a protective reflex triggered by the unearthing of its deepest secret. Alex recoiled, not just from the pain, but from the chilling confirmation that this wasn't a figment of his unraveling mind. This was a direct, malevolent response from an entity intrinsically linked to a forgotten promise, a pact forged in the crucible of combat that he had. Until now, suppressed with a desperate, self-preserving amnesia, the Shadow wasn't just watching him, it was guarding the secret. The truth, when it finally broke through the layers of denial, was far more insidious than simple battlefield trauma. It wasn't a forgotten promise to a dying comrade, but an unspoken bargain. A silent agreement amongst a desperate few to ensure their own survival at the expense of another. In the chaos of that final mission, cornered and outmaneuvered, a choice was made, a line crossed, signal deliberately delayed, a position abandoned, or a critical piece of intelligence withheld, something that led directly to the tragic demise of a specific squad member, perhaps even an entire unit. This wasn't an accident of war, it was a calculated sacrifice, a burden of complicity that had festered in the dark recesses of Alex's memory, giving birth to the very shadow that now consumed him. This entity, therefore, wasn't merely a manifestation of Alex's profound guilt. It was a spiritual consequence, a vengeful force born from that specific act of betrayal. It was the embodiment of the injustice, the unresolved agony of the one left behind, tethered to Alex by the unbreakable chains of his complicity. Its purpose went beyond mere torment, sought a reckoning, a cosmic rebalancing for the scales tipped so violently on that blood-soaked field. The Shadow was a living, breathing testament to broken trust, a relentless hunter seeking not just his sanity, but a profound form of retribution. And now, its demands were beginning to crystallize, piercing through the fog of Alex's terror. The Shadow wasn't content with just haunting him. It wanted something specific. It craved a payment, a profound restitution for the life, or lives, sacrificed in that unspoken bargain. Was it confession? A public admission of his darkest secret, tearing down the carefully constructed facade of the war hero? Or perhaps it sought a more tangible, or devastating form of penance, sacrifice mirroring the one he had participated in years ago. The Shadow's relentless pursuit was not aimless. It was a focused, malevolent will, driving Alex towards an inevitable confrontation with the price of his past. He stared into the abyss of this newfound understanding, the initial shock giving way to a chilling clarity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now laced with a terrifying purpose. He finally understood the enemy, understood what it wanted, and the sheer impossibility of escaping its grasp. The veil had been partially lifted, revealing not just a tormentor, but a judge, jury, and executioner, demanding a verdict that would irrevocably alter the course of his existence. He had disturbed its rest, and now the Shadow was ready to collect its due, forcing Alex to confront a choice more horrifying than any battlefield decision. The veil had been ripped, not entirely, but enough for Alex to glimpse the abyssal hunger that lay beneath. It wasn't just the agony of the fallen or the echo of a broken promise. It was a profound, almost cosmic imbalance that the Shadow sought to rectify. This entity wasn't a passive manifestation of guilt, but an active, sentient force, a collector of debts, and Alex, he now understood, was the principal debtor. The revelation hit him with the force of a physical blow, stripping away any lingering hope that this was merely a psychological torment. No, this was real, ancient, and utterly merciless, its demands beginning to coalesce into a chilling clarity. What it truly desired, Alex realized with a sickening lurch, was not just his suffering, but a specific form of restitution. The spiritual consequence tied to the battlefield incident wasn't an abstract concept. It was a tangible void, a gaping wound in the fabric of reality that his actions or inactions had created. The Shadow, therefore, was not merely vengeful. It was a rebalancing mechanism, an almost elemental force compelled to restore equilibrium. It wasn't seeking to punish him for revenge's sake, but to extract the precise payment for the cosmic debt incurred, a payment so profound it threatened to dismantle the very core of his being. The price, Alex finally comprehended, was not some external act of penance, but an internal evisceration. The shadow demanded he confront an ultimate, horrifying truth about himself, a truth so deeply buried and so intrinsically linked to the original sin of that battlefield that it would shatter his carefully constructed identity. It wasn't a public confession. It was a private, agonizing excavation of his own soul, forcing him to acknowledge his complicity, his selfishness, or perhaps the profound moral failing that had festered beneath the surface, feeding the shadow all along. This truth was the bedrock of the bargain, the unacknowledged cost of his own survival. The weight of this demand was crushing, a spiritual gravity that threatened to collapse him. The shadow's presence, once a shimmering distortion, felt solid, pressing in on him, its unseen tendrils probing the deepest recesses of his mind, seeking out the very core of this hidden truth. Every defense he had ever erected, every rationalization, every self-deception was being meticulously stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. He felt an overwhelming urge to resist, to scream, to flee, but there was nowhere to go, no corner of his consciousness left untouched by its relentless scrutiny. The implications for his future, for any semblance of peace, were catastrophic. Survival, then, was not a gift, but a perpetual burden, a state of being predicated on an unbearable, self-inflicted wound. The shadow presented a choice, stark and unforgiving. Embrace this horrifying truth, accept the dismantling of everything he thought he was, and perhaps find a twisted form of peace. Or refuse, and face an ultimate, unimaginable doom, a complete erasure not just of his life, but of his very essence. The entity's true desire was not his death, but his transformation through this crucible of self-discovery. A monstrous rebirth that would forever bind him to the heavy price of his past. Alex accepted the chilling truth. The shadow wasn't merely guilt. It was a sentient, ancient hunger, a spiritual consequence demanding a profound recalibration of his existence. There was no running, no hiding, no negotiation. The battlefield would be a crucible forged in his own mind, a place where echoes of past decisions resonated with potent force. He knew where he had to go, not geographically, but existentially, to the psychological ground zero where the incident had truly taken root. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about defining what remained of his soul. It was a journey he had to take alone, into the heart of his own darkness, to face the shadow on its own terms. He had to relive that moment, not as a victim of trauma, but as the architect of his own damnation. Only by willingly stepping back into that fire could he hope to understand the debt he owed, and what terrible price the shadow would demand in payment. The true war was just beginning. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the darkness. If you were captivated by Alex's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. What do you think the shadow will demand? Let me know in the comments below. See you next time. His preparation wasn't forged in steel, but in the relentless crucible of his own mind. He didn't just remember his past, he returned to it, becoming an archaeologist of his own pain. He delved into the archives of memory, not to relive the agony, but to dissect it, to understand its very architecture. Every fear, every regret, every sliver of doubt the entity had ever used against him was now laid bare on the operating table of his consciousness. He wasn't trying to erase his vulnerabilities. He was embracing them, weaving them into a stronger, more honest version of himself. This was his armor forged from acceptance, not denial. A shield against the insidious whispers that had haunted his every waking moment. The journey to this final stand was a deliberate descent into his personal abyss. He walked willingly through the darkest corridors of his past, feeling the immense gravity of his choices pulling him deeper and deeper. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken truths, and the spectral presence of what awaited him. This wasn't a physical place you could find on a map. It was a convergence point in his soul, a place where time blurred and the boundaries between reality and memory dissolved into nothing. Every step, every single breath, was a conscious act of defiance. A quiet declaration that he would meet this force on its own terms, right in the heart of his own torment. As he arrived, not in body, but in spirit, the entity's presence was overwhelming, a crushing, suffocating intensity. It was a pressure on his mind, a cold, empty void threatening to consume all light, all hope. It was a silent scream that echoed with the unfulfilled vengeance it represented, This was no creature of flesh and bone. It was a pure distillation of consequence itself, a psychic predator that fed on unresolved anguish. It hung there in the metaphorical air, a colossal, formless shadow, yet its focus was undeniably singular, its entire being a single, unyielding demand. The confrontation began, not with a roar, but with a silent, profound assault on his very identity. Memories, vivid and agonizing, flooded his consciousness. The battlefield, the cries of the wounded, the impossible choices he'd had to make, the faces of the fallen, their eyes haunting him. The crushing weight of his own survival? The entity sought to overwhelm him, to fracture his mind with the guilt he had suppressed for so long. It wanted to force an admission from him, a confession that would shatter his will to pieces. But Alex, prepared for this, stood firm. He didn't fight the memories themselves. He fought the entity's insidious interpretation of them, refusing to surrender the narrative of his own existence. The silence that followed was not the quiet of victory, but a hollow, empty echo. The oppressive weight lifted, not with a triumphant burst of light, but with a slow, insidious withdrawal, like a tide pulling back from a ravaged shore. Alex stood amidst the ruins of his own psyche. The battlefield was now strangely calm, yet it was utterly transformed. The shadow had receded, its form dissolving not into oblivion, but into the very fabric of the air around him. It left a pervasive chill that settled deep within his bones. He wasn't left with relief, but with an unsettling emptiness, a void where the primal fear once resided. Now it was replaced by a profound, chilling understanding. He hadn't defeated it. Not in the way you defeat an enemy in battle. Instead, he had merely withstood its assault. It allowed it to pass through him, to scour the deepest recesses of his being. The shadow hadn't been banished. It had been absorbed. It had taught him its language. It had shown him its true nature, not as some external predator, but as a reflection, a distorted mirror of the latent darkness that exists within all consciousness. Its victory was just the end of the direct conflict. A truce bought at the terrible price of an indelible imprint, a permanent fixture within his very soul. The chilling truth unfurled in his mind. The shadow's ultimate purpose was never destruction. It was integration. It sought to understand, to mimic, to become. It had drawn him into its vortex not to consume his life, but to glean the very essence of his existence, to learn the intricate dance of human resilience and despair. Alex was no longer just a survivor. He was a vessel, an unwitting host to a fragment of its boundless, amorphous intelligence. He was forever marked by its touch, a living testament to its pervasive, unending influence. Days turned into weeks. The world seemed to regain its mundane, everyday rhythms. Yet for Alex, nothing was the same. He began to perceive the subtle shifts in reality, the faint distortions in the periphery of his vision. He heard the whispers in the crowd that weren't quite human. He saw its reflection in the anxious eyes of strangers on the street, in the simmering resentments that bubbled just beneath the surface of society, in the creeping despair that seemed to infect the global consciousness like a virus. The shadow hadn't vanished. It had merely diversified. It was spreading its tendrils through the collective psyche of humanity, finding purchase in every crack of human vulnerability. And then, the final, horrifying realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The confrontation was never about him alone. He was merely a conduit, a proving ground. The shadow's true target was not an individual, but the very concept of humanity's collective spirit. Its lingering presence inside him was a seed, a blueprint, a constant reminder that the war had only just begun. It had learned from him, it had adapted. And now, armed with the intimate knowledge of human fear and human resilience, it was ready to wage a new kind of war. A war that was unseen, unheard, and utterly pervasive. It left Alex with the haunting, bone-chilling dread of a future where true light might never again exist without its ever-present, insidious counterpart. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, be sure to subscribe for more content that explores the deeper, darker corners of existence.